Thank you. Thank you and hello, everyone. My name's Stephen Cragg and I'm Chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales. We're known as BHRC, and I'm chairing this session today. BHRC is delighted to be hosting this virtual panel event. It brings together leading lawyers and civil society representatives to spotlight serious concerns about human rights violations and the rule of law in Myanmar. This panel event is the fourth event in BHRC's Diminishing Democracy series. We had earlier events on rule of law in India, held virtually in September 2021, Sri Lanka in October 2022, and Pakistan in February 2023. Today's event will be followed by a fifth and final panel discussion on Bangladesh in late July 2023. The discussions from all five events will be synthesized into a report with recommendations that will be published later this year by BHRC. Myanmar's rule of law and human rights norms and standards have undergone a profound regression following the military coup against the democratically elected government in 2021. This has led to severe human rights challenges that continue to adversely impact human rights defenders, including lawyers, judges, and NGO workers. The rule of law has been heavily compromised. The military government has disregarded international law, targeted civilians in hostilities, and carried out extrajudicial executions. It has destroyed civilian structures, including homes, clinics, schools, and places of worship. Since 2021, the military has carried out a nationwide crackdown on dissent, carried out mass killings, arbitrary arrests, and other human rights abuses. A climate of fear and insecurity has been created that severely restricts freedom of speech and assembly. Over 16,000 people have been detained, most of whom face specious charges in military-controlled courts in blatant breach of due process and fair trial rights. The situation has resulted in a large-scale humanitarian crisis with an estimated 1.2 million people internally displaced and over 70,000 having left the country. They have joined, according to the OHCHR, over 1 million others, including the bulk of the country's Rohingya Muslim population who fled sustained persecution and attacks over the past decades. Human rights defenders in Myanmar face grave risks. They have been targeted by the military, leading to instances of murder, disappearance, arrest, detention, torture, and sexual violence. Women human rights defenders are under specific threat, especially those who assist survivors of gender-based violence. Many human rights defenders are constantly on the move to avoid military checkpoints and potential seizure of their documents. The military's refusal to engage in meaningful dialogue and allow international observers into the country compounds these problems. The disregard of Myanmar's generals for the five-point consensus agreed upon by regional leaders has further escalated the crisis. Calls for the release of all political prisoners have been ignored. Restoring respect for human rights is key to resolving the crisis in Myanmar. This involves holding human rights violators accountable, bringing the current government under effective civilian oversight, and restoring democratic rule. Human rights defenders need comprehensive support from the international community of legal practitioners, NGOs, and bar associations. In this session, we will discuss what can and should be done to restore respect for human rights and the rule of law in Myanmar, and explore how the international community can more effectively support legal practitioners, judges, and civil society organizations, as well as human rights defenders in Myanmar. I'm proud to welcome a distinguished panel of guests joining us today, and I'm going to do some brief introductions before we get started. First of all, we have the Honourable Tom Andrews, who's the Special Rapporteur for the United Nations on Myanmar. Tom is a former member of the US Congress from Maine. He's a Rabina Senior Human Rights Fellow at Yale University Law School, and as an associate of Harvard University's Asia Center. He has served as General Secretary of the Nobel Peace Laureate Campaign for Aung San Suu Kyi and the people of Burma in 2001, and was a consultant for the National Coalition Government of the Union of Burma and the Euro-Burma Network. We have Elaine Chan, who's the Human Rights Officer for the UN Human Rights Office of the High Commission on Human Rights in Bangkok. Elaine is a rule of law and access to justice consultant, experienced in governance and development issues within the Asia-Pacific region. Elaine's work at OHCHR focuses on country developments in Myanmar, where she lived for 5.5 years. She holds bachelor's degrees in law and economics and an LLM in public law from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University. We have Dr. Felicity Gerry KC, who's an International King's Counsel and Professor of Legal Practice. She's a high-profile legal expert who's led or contributed to a number of research projects and just joined us. Hello. And government submissions on a range of issues, including investments in Myanmar and modern slavery. Next, we have Antonia Mulvey, who's the founder and executive director of Legal Action Worldwide. Antonia is a British lawyer with 20 years of experience in international human rights, refugee and criminal law. Antonia has established and headed rule of law and access to justice programs for the UN and NGOs in Sudan, Somalia, and the occupied Palestinian territory. In 2017, she was appointed as SGBV investigator for the UN International Independent Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar. Aarif Abraham is a barrister and writer. He specializes in public international law, including international human rights law, international criminal law, and international arbitration. Aarif has advised individuals, companies, public interest groups, and states in public international law, criminal and human rights cases, as well as advising widely on policy issues. He has also advised policymakers, parliamentarians, and practitioners broadly on foreign policy and rule of law issues. Hanh Nguyen is a senior labour rights researcher at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. Hanh is currently leading research projects on labour rights in the global garment supply chains in Myanmar and Sri Lanka. She was also the winning author of the 2019 Decent Work Prize of the International Labour Organization for her research, Expectations versus Reality, the well-being of female migrant workers in garment factories in Myanmar. So that's our star-spangled lineup for the session today. Thank you to all our speakers and to all our guests for joining us today. We'll hear briefly from all our contributors today, and then we'll also make time for an extended Q&A with plenty of time for questions. So please either pop them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those when we can. So I'm going to start off asking Tom if he can make some initial remarks. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to join this program and this very distinguished and knowledgeable panel. And I want to ask you to please accept my apology at the outset. I cannot stay for the entire program. I'm about to hit the proverbial road that will take me to Indonesia as a part of a formal mission, but then 3 other nations for bilateral, more behind the scenes discussions about the role that they are playing or could be playing with respect to the crisis in Myanmar. So I apologize in advance for having to leave early. The focus of today's session, of course, is diminishing democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in Myanmar. And let me say at the outset that democracy is not diminishing in Myanmar. It has crashed and burned while human rights and the rule of law are non-existent. The deteriorating conditions Stephen mentioned in Myanmar continue to get even more grim. Nearly 19,000 political prisoners behind bars right now. More than 3,600 civilians have been killed by the junta. 1.5 million have been displaced since the coup. More than 60,000 civilian homes and structures have been burned, and 17.6 million people were in dire need of humanitarian assistance. And this was even before Cyclone Mocha hit. So a true disaster. And what is making things exponentially worse is the fact that the military is significantly increasing the use of air-based attacks on villages. There were well over 400 of these airstrikes in just the first 4 months of 2023. Villages, IDP camps, hospitals, schools, they've all been attacked, burned to the ground. And of course, when we speak of this horrific reality in Myanmar, we do so more so than not in terms of numbers. But of course, we should not forget the fact that we're talking about real people with real families. Men, women, children, young people who are not very different from any of us, except for the fact that this horror has descended upon them. And I have had the real honor to meet many people throughout Myanmar since this crisis descended on the country. And I've had the privilege of being able to speak directly to them. I was speaking to a father, for example, who had reached out to me, wanted to speak to me, and he had just, his village had been destroyed, his house had been burned to the ground. He brought his family to an IDP center for safety, and 2 days before we met, his only two daughters, ages 12 and 15, were killed when the junta attacked the IDP center, bombing their center and the tent that they were staying in. This is truly horrific. Well, what can, as Stephen asked, what can the international community do? I think number one, we can begin by recognizing and coming to terms with the fact that what we are doing is not working. Frankly, the world is failing the people of Myanmar. And we need to ask why and what we can do to more effectively support the courageous people of Myanmar who are fighting for their country and for their children's future. Now, many governments have been saying the right things and have been doing so from the very outset of the launch of the coup in February of 2021. They've condemned the coup and attacks on civilians. They voiced support for those who are standing up for human rights in Myanmar and resisting the junta, including the National Unity Government and the network of organizations inside and outside of Myanmar who continue to demonstrate remarkable courage, creativity, and tenacity. And they've supported resolutions within the United Nations and beyond and have provided critically important aid. But what is urgently required, in my view, is action now that can deny the junta what it most needs to continue its war against the people of Myanmar: weapons, money, and legitimacy. That we hold those responsible for this horror in Myanmar fully accountable, and that we address through a significant increase in the level of support, the growing humanitarian crisis for those inside of Myanmar and for those who have been forced to run for their lives over the Myanmar border. Let me just talk about them in these needs, at least briefly in turn. First of all, weapons. The junta has procured and continues to procure weapons, dual-use technology and materials to manufacture weapons due to the support and the cooperation of some UN member states and many businesses. And I've outlined this in two reports that are available at the UN website under the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and Special Procedures. One of them is Enabling Atrocities, which focuses on the role of member states in arms transfers, which I published last year. And then the billion-dollar death trade that identifies arms dealers and networks that are facilitating the transfer of $1 billion worth of weapons. That is since the coup, as well as dual-use technology and materials to the junta's forces. And I published that last month. It comes as no surprise to anyone here, I'm sure, that Russia and China continue to be the largest supplier of weapons to the junta. But what is very important to know is that they are not the only source of weapons and weapons materials. Arms dealers are finding a number of ways to circumvent sanctions that have been imposed, including the creation of fake companies through which to move weapons. This is a relatively easy approach that they are using, and they are depending upon the lack of sanctions enforcement, which is a huge, huge challenge. And I refer to this and give details and illustrations of this in my most recent report. Money, listen, the junta sees its military and its weapons as its strength, and indeed, reviled as they are by the people of Myanmar, without soldiers, without weapons, without brutality, they have nothing. But what they see as a strength is also a vulnerability. It takes money, and lots of it, to sustain this military and the infrastructure that enables it. We need to much more effectively seize upon this vulnerability. Now, the good news is that countries like the UK, the US, EU, Canada, more recently Australia, have imposed various sanctions on the junta and its enablers. The bad news is that these sanctions are limited and they remain much less effective than they can and they must be. This is because they lack coordination. There was a recent study that noted that out of 165 entities sanctioned by the US, UK, and EU, only 22 of those 165 were sanctioned by all three. And in the $1 billion death trade paper that I've just referred to, we look at in some detail the sanctions and how they're applied by these countries, and how they are able to, that is, the arms dealers and traders are able to get around them. They continue to fail, that is, these sanctions to target some of the junta's largest sources of weapons. As I note in this report, only the EU has sanctioned the junta's single largest source of revenue, Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, for example. Only Canada is sanctioning Myanmar Foreign Trade Bank and the Myanmar Investment and Commercial Bank, financial institutions that are used by the junta to purchase weapons and repatriate revenues to Myanmar. In addition to denying the junta these three conditions for its survival, the international community must also enhance the pursuit of accountability. And before I mention accountability, I just want to say that the junta is working very hard to present the veneer of legitimacy. It's doing so however it can find it. It's why the junta's ringleader, Min Aung Hlaing, attended the ASEAN summit in April of 2021, embracing and committing to the implementation of the so-called 5-point consensus. It's why it manipulates its participation in various regional and international forums. It's why it welcomes and uses its media outlets to promote international entities and delegations who might visit Myanmar. And it's why it is trying to organize what it will try to describe as an election. Its plans are on hold. That is, the election plans are on hold due to, among other things, an environment that is anything but conducive to an election. And indeed, as Japan has noted, it could drive even greater instability and violence. It is critical that nations reject this farce for what it is, and not under any conditions provide any form of support, including financial or technical support, that could be used by the junta to promote the fiction that it is in any way legitimate. And I detail these recommendations in a report that I released in January, Illegal and Illegitimate, again available on the UN website. Now let me talk just briefly about the need to enhance the pursuit of accountability. Obviously, the best way to pursue this would be through a Security Council resolution and that refers the junta and the crisis to the ICC. Needless to say, this is not going to happen under the current membership of the Security Council, but there are paths that can and should be worth pursuing, including those that are underway, including the use of the International Criminal Court, which is being a case opened, as you all know, in 2019 regarding the forced deportation of the Rohingya into Bangladesh. There's, of course, the IIMM, the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. There's the genocide case at the International Court of Justice, and there are universal jurisdiction cases. So far, they've been brought in Australia, Chile, Germany, Indonesia, Turkey, I encourage any nation with universal jurisdiction enabling statutes to pursue them, and those without such statutes should consider legislation to create them. Finally, providing adequate humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian response, quite frankly, to this crisis has been grossly inadequate, and it's getting worse. Let me just say as an example, those Rohingya who ran for their lives because of the genocidal attacks of 2016 and 2017 over to the border in Bangladesh are facing horrific conditions. Only 63% of the Rohingya Humanitarian Crisis Joint Response Plan was funded last year, and only 24% have been funded in 2023, with nearly half the year behind us. The result has been hunger. There's been malnutrition. Over 41% of children in these camps have stunted growth. The World Food Program announced a 17% cut in these food rations that are inadequate in March. They've just announced 2 weeks ago an additional 20% cut on top of that 17%. So right now, Rohingya people need to live on food rations of 27 cents per day, and I've spoken to many of them. And this is not only about hunger and malnutrition, it's also generating increased insecurity and violence within the camps. And of course, it is making many people think about getting on boats and heading out to sea, or heading over dangerous land routes into safety. There was a 350% increase in people taking these routes, putting their lives and their families' lives in the hands of traffickers. There is going to be a significant increase, I predict, after this current rainy season as a result of these deteriorating conditions. A very similar situation inside of Myanmar with the Myanmar Humanitarian Response Plan funded 41% in all of last year, only 10% funded this year. And of course, many CSOs are operating inside the country to distribute cross-border aid, and they are terribly underfunded. Let me conclude by simply saying that the junta would like the people of Myanmar to believe, and for the international community to believe, that like it or not, it will prevail, that a military-ruled Myanmar is inevitable. They are wrong, and they are wrong because I can assure you, those within Myanmar who are risking all to save their nation and their children's future from this nightmares, many of whom I've had the privilege to engage with, are not giving in, they are not giving up. They continue their relentless, creative, and tenacious opposition in every corner of Myanmar, but they need and they deserve our support. That begins with a fundamental reassessment of the role that the international community has played, and how we can and how we must not only express our support for the people of Myanmar in words, but more importantly, with action. Action that will deny the junta what it requires to continue its systematic assault on the rights, the lives, and the future of the people of Myanmar. Thank you for your commitment to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And thank you for the opportunity to join you today and hopefully collaborate with you in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tom, so much for that, laying it on the line, for laying the scene, setting the scene for the rest of our speakers today. We're going to move on now to Felicity. Glad you can make it. Felicity, looks like you're just out of court. So you're next up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and very moving words from Tom there. I am very proud to speak at this event, and was very proud to be instructed by Justice for Myanmar, a campaign group through the Australian Centre for International Justice. So like all barristers, I'm going to tell you the story because I think it picks up on what Tom said about money, particularly in the context of construction and communication. So I was instructed with a brilliant junior called Dae Gang to really not so much advise on, but to prepare a memo initially relating to the construction of what was called the Golden City complex within Myanmar. And a company called ETC with commercial ties to the Myanmar military junta and its conglomerates was seeking to list the Golden City investment opportunity on the Singapore Stock Exchange. And what was really interesting was that SGX, the Singapore Stock Exchange, had indeed commissioned 2 reports by 2 sets of consultants that were said to be independent reviews into the contractual payments to the Quartermaster General's office in the Myanmar military that would be paid as a result of this investment being listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange. So as is my wont, I like a bit of lateral thinking. So I was asked to have a look at this because there were the 2 independent reports. And frankly, I think this is here where we can have international community action. I'm quite surprised we haven't had more memos like this to more stock exchanges, because what we did was we produced a memo which is publicly available. I can put the link in the chat once I've stopped speaking. And we tried to cover everything from a due diligence perspective. So I looked at the situation in what I would call a compliance mesh, criminal law as part of a compliance mesh, business and human rights as part of a compliance mesh. So, for example, we considered far more issues than those independent reports had done on state and corporate responsibility under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, due diligence risks associated with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, supply chains and modern slavery, state responsibility for international wrongful acts, so a bit of torts law, implications arising out of the Singapore-Myanmar bilateral investment treaty. And it's really important to remember that a massive proportion of investment within Myanmar comes from Singapore, and the Singapore Stock Exchange, of course, is globally powerful. So there must be lots of corporates and individuals that would have an interest in all these implications. Add to that commercial liability risks in relation to genocide, construction contracts, land disputes, criminal liability for atrocities, human trafficking, terrorist financing and money laundering. Add to that international sanctions risks. It was a lot of homework for me and DIA, risks arising out of bribery, corruption, legal frameworks that, of course, for example, from the UK are global, and potential risks on breaches of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, to which Singapore is at least a signatory, and other breaches of international humanitarian law. And in perhaps one of the greatest moments of my career, ETC, that was seeking to list this investment opportunity within Myanmar on the Singapore Stock Exchange, sent a letter asking for more time as a result of our memo. So I'm named forever in that request for a delay. And as far as I know, it still hasn't been listed. You can follow up the detail in your own time. So I would very much like that framework. I suppose I ought to write the book up really, but that framework to be applied by everybody. We wrote it, we did the homework, it's sitting there, it's publicly available. And these are all the things that we should be thinking about. And we might need multiple practitioners. I didn't give advice. I didn't say you're doing this wrong. I simply said, I think you need to have a look at all of this. And if that prevented the listing, then I'm really proud of what we did. But I also would like that sort of framework to be understood. And very quickly, because I don't want to talk beyond my turn, which I tend to do, after that, I was instructed to assist the same campaign group, the same NGO, in relation to the sale of Telenor Myanmar. Now, Telenor is a Norwegian group. They were quite keen to uphold of human rights. They were quite keen to still supply mobile telecommunications networks within Myanmar. But then they took the view that they couldn't maintain that. So they decided to sell, excuse me, I think I've probably got to jump about. They decided to sell to a Lebanese company. And again, there were concerns that there were connections between that company and the military junta. So we got involved again to look at the risks in all those areas of potential litigation for the sale. If you think about the sale of data, the past data for people who are trying to communicate within Myanmar. Now that sale went ahead, but Telenor did get involved in further negotiations. But it was again one of those situations where you're trying to say, look, don't sell, try and stay where you are. But if you do sell, please don't sell to someone who may be connected to the military junta. And there has been some movement and some negotiation around that case that, again, I think it's worth looking up. But frankly, that's little old me and my junior trying to do these big things. And I think I'd love lots of people to copy me, but also look at that bigger picture that brings the question of money and connects it to the question of accountability. And if possible, cutting off the financial supply. So their stories, I'll stop now. I'll put some links in the chat so that you can read them in your own time. But I think adding to what Tom says, we know what's going on in the ground. We've got these really brave campaigners who are asking for help. Where possible as a practitioner, I've helped. But this framework of really understanding how you can contain the behavior in Myanmar that is so affecting the human rights of the people on the ground, I would like that to be more greatly understood. Thank you. Stephen, you're on mute, I think, so I can't hear you.
Well, that's not very good as I'm the chair. I was on mute.
We all do it. I'll stop.
I was, of course, thanking you and for that really interesting case study, giving us some ideas about what we can all do and think about. Our next speaker, Aarif, is going to give us some thoughts about state responsibility for international crimes and violations, I think. Thank you, Aarif.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Let me begin by thanking the Bar Human Rights Committee for the invitation, and for Stephen and Louise for putting the work into for bringing us together. It's a real honor. I'd like to use the short time I have to make 3 points and reserve some of the detail for the questions and answers. The 3 points I'd like to make is to begin with really back to basics and to explain what state responsibility for international crimes and violations are and what are third state obligations arising. The second point I'd like to make is what existing mechanisms engage state or individual criminal responsibility and what are their scope. And third, I'll end by explaining the practical effects at focusing on Myanmar state agents, organs, and officials, and then explaining what are critically the limitations and what it is we can do in terms of next steps. To begin with the first point on state responsibility, Tom has put in incredibly powerful words the stark and horrifying situation in Myanmar. And needless to say, the array of violations and crimes being committed by the junta, which obviously remains in government in Myanmar, is strikingly vast, from crimes committed in the context of what are now several internal armed conflicts to long-standing practices of inequality and discrimination against minorities, which we know has culminated in deep and continuing persecution of various minority groups in Myanmar, including the Rohingya, the Karen, the Karenni, the Arakanese, the Chin, the Mon, and so forth. Now, Myanmar's armed forces have been embroiled in what you might loosely call a civil war with numerous armed groups for decades, and that has led to a vast array of serious human rights violations and crimes, including murder, rape, and other forms of serious sexual violence, forced labor, arbitrary arrest, torture, and other forms of ill treatment, which Tom has very eloquently explained. Following the 2021 coup, obviously that has escalated at a vast level. And my understanding is, in respect of the conflict to date, what's happening in terms of control is that the junta forces remain in control of less than 25% of the territory. 50% is controlled by armed minority groups and opposition People's Defense Forces, and the rest is contested. And obviously that situation is moving rapidly. So what does international law have to say about all these violations? Well, ordinarily, when it comes to core international crimes, by which we mean torture, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, we divide responsibility into state responsibility and individual criminal responsibility. All states have certain obligations arising from treaty, custom, or conventions. And the law relating to state responsibility essentially concerns the breach of any of these obligations by a state in international law. States can be held and must be held responsible for international crimes. Why? Because they comprise what is known as internationally wrongful acts for the protection of the international community's fundamental interests, that its breach is recognized by a crime by the community of nations. And those crimes are seen as violations of what's known as peremptory norms, which include war crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression, colonial domination, apartheid, and genocide. And there are, of course, legal consequences that arise as a result of the breach, and they are not limited to states or the state in question. Third states have elevated obligations where peremptory norms are breached, and Tom and Felicity have obviously alluded to these. And essentially that is that the seriousness of the violation of the peremptory norm necessitates on the part of the international community a collective response to counteract the effects of the breach. And these obligations are unequivocal, and they are bound, and they bind all nations, and they include non-recognition, non-assistance, cooperation to bring to an end the violation in question. So the harms that Tom and Felicity have mentioned, selling of oil, equipment, materiel, dual-use goods, these are all prohibited in international law. Now, certain violations of international law can also entail individual criminal responsibility. That means individuals, persons who aid, abet, order, supervise, or jointly perpetrate in these international crimes can be individually held responsible, and I'll return to that in a second. So what are the obligations that are engaged in respect of Myanmar? The problem we have is that Myanmar has not signed many of the core international treaties, and neither has it ratified them. The 2 or 3 it has signed and ratified, it has placed reservations on them so as not to be bound by individual complaints, or it precludes interstate dispute resolution. So one state is unable to sue Myanmar for its violations. This means essentially that recourse to international mechanisms other than soft mechanisms are limited, but there are some exceptions. Myanmar has ratified the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, but it's put a reservation on the dispute resolution clause. It's also not possible to make individual complaints. It's ratified the Child Rights Convention and the International Convention on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, but again, no individual complaints. It's ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The Genocide Convention is an exception. It's ratified that, and it has no reservations on that. And that's why there is a case before the International Court of Justice, which concerns the application, interpretation, and fulfillment of Myanmar's obligations to prevent, punish, and to have domestic legislation giving effect to the provisions of the Genocide Convention. It's not signed and ratified the Torture Convention. It's not signed and ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and neither has it signed a core treaty, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But needless to say, where we are concerned with core international crimes that I've mentioned, Myanmar, as are all other nations, bound by what is known as customary international law, and there are some obligations arising from that. So what are the key existing mechanisms that are currently in play? I'll just quickly run through them for shortness of time, but the 5 or 6 key things that are available and are being utilized internationally is, of course, the International Court of Justice, that is Gambia suing Myanmar for its violation of the Genocide Convention in respect of the Rohingya. And the Rohingya, Tom has described, are in a very precarious position. They are largely all displaced to Bangladesh. There's all manner of crimes that were committed against them in Myanmar. And worst, currently, some of these Rohingya people are being unlawfully repatriated back into Myanmar, which is a contravention of international law. There's the independent international mechanism on Myanmar, which Tom has talked about a little. The International Criminal Court is seized of, limitedly seized by these, what were designated by the government as clearance operations of Rohingya, which essentially displaced and unlawfully deported the Rohingya into Bangladesh. And that's the reason the International Criminal Court, which doesn't have jurisdiction over Myanmar, but does have jurisdiction over Bangladesh, has been investigating those transnational crimes. Fourth, there is a universal case in Argentina that's currently limited to the situation of the Rohingya. And then the two broad universal jurisdiction cases that are that concern also issues in respect of the coup since 2021 is a complaint filed in Turkey under universal jurisdiction, which alleges torture and other crimes against humanity. And then a really interesting and probably the most comprehensive case there is a case filed in Germany this year against senior Myanmar military generals and other actors identified for complicity in genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And the complaint covers issues in respect of the violations against the Rohingya, as well as a vast array of allegations emanating since February 2021. So what are the practical effects of focusing on state responsibility in addition to individual criminal responsibility? Well, the practical effect is, of course, you have these international mechanisms which could be binding on Myanmar if they are available. But of course, the problem is that there is very little international recourse for survivors and victims. And the narrow litigation that we see is essentially promising, but it's very limited in scope and scale. One day, however, the incredible work that's being done by survivors and people on the ground is being collected in repositories at the UN. So one day there's a hope that can be used by third states under universal jurisdiction. What can we do in 2 minutes to change the current situation? I think Tom touched upon a lot of points, and just quickly, I'd make 5 very short points. Of course, in time, the Myanmar state itself, and of course the junta will not do this, needs to reform its outdated domestic laws and ratify the relevant international treaties that I've mentioned. Second, there must be a guarantee of individual rights within Myanmar itself through the ratification of these treaties and brought into the domestic law. Third, the UN Security Council, of course, can put forth a resolution referring the situation in Myanmar to the ICC. Russia and China will veto that, but the International Criminal Court can, in theory, and this is contentious, accept the declaration from Myanmar's pro-democracy national unity government under the Rome Statute as the legitimate representative of the state, even though the ICJ refused to do that. That is a contentious, complex issue which can possibly be done. And then the international community can come together publicly to support the creation of an ad hoc international tribunal, push through the UN General Assembly, and there is precedent for that. Fourth, the international community, as Tom has said, can impose various sanctions, and those are individual, corporate, as well as state. And of course, those can be targeted to the dual-use goods and oil and revenue mechanisms. And then fifth and finally, aside from these really big macro justice mechanisms, we shouldn't forget, as I think both Felicity and Tom have said, that it's imperative that the international community continues to consult with local civil society organizations for an up-to-date situational analysis on the ground, what their concerns are, what the issues are that they are facing, including immediate access to psychological, medical, and other support, and ultimately to understand what justice really means for them, because we can contribute, but we can't lead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aarif, for that succinct description of international law structure and how that might be used. Our next speaker is Antonia, who's going to speak to us, I think, about from the perspective of working with victims and survivors. Thank you, Antonia.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation to be on this distinguished panel. And I think it couldn't have come actually at a better time, considering the situation in Myanmar, but also, unfortunately, that the spotlight at the same time is moving away from Myanmar. Let's be clear about that. Now, I'm the Executive Director of Legal Action Worldwide. We're a non-profit organisation comprised of lawyers and jurists representing thousands of victims and survivors of human rights violations and abuses in fragile and conflict-affected areas across Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. It is very difficult work. We are on the front lines with our lawyers working right in the camps and many difficult conflicts. I'm going to go straight into the situation of Myanmar and what are we doing there. And what I want to focus on today is what is the experiences of victims and survivors from Myanmar? What are they asking for? And in particular, I'm going to focus in on sexual violence. We often we ask them, what kind of justice do you want and how can we help you to secure it? And currently we're representing hundreds of Rohingya in their quest for international justice because they state that they cannot obtain that in Myanmar. They fled Myanmar during the 2016 and 2017 clearance operations and are now residing in Bangladesh, and we represent them in multiple intertwined international justice proceedings. You've heard them all today, in the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice.
Oh, if we lost Antonia, it looks as though we have. We'll just give it a second to see if we get her back again.
Now, within Myanmar, we're looking at sexual violence that has taken place post-coup. Equally difficult, working both victims and survivors and national organisations. Now, if I look at the hallmarks and the similarities, what do we have if we look at sexual violence, a grave human rights violation in the situation of Myanmar, as we've heard, often amounting frequently to an international crime? Well, let's go back in time. In fact, although we are representing victims and survivors post-coup and prior to the coup from 2016 and 2017, this is not a new crime. In fact, the first UN report of sexual violence came out in the 1990s. And since that time, we haven't actually addressed the issue of sexual violence. It's rooted in deep gender inequality. And we heard earlier about the title of the panel, and I totally agree with Tom Andrews. It's not, unfortunately, democracy is not diminishing, it's non-existent. And there is a total absence of the rule of law. And there is almost complete impunity, although not quite, because as we've heard, there are ongoing cases. So with that, we have the backdrop, history of decades of sexual violence being carried out, the allegations mainly against the Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw, and ongoing allegations, but with total impunity. What do I mean? It's a hallmark of the Myanmar military. And I think unless we address that, we're not going to be able to bring rule of law, we're not going to be able to bring democracy to Myanmar. It's already hanging on a thread, non-existent. So let's look at where we are in this time. I want to talk about the victims and survivors. Back in 2017, you heard I was an investigator. I was deployed on the border of Myanmar and Bangladesh, and as a UN investigator, interviewing hundreds of Rohingya that were fleeing at that time. And they said, all of them, it was hundreds, I interviewed nearly 150, we want justice. I honestly thought at that time it was going to be impossible to bring any semblance of justice to those victims and survivors. Fast forward now, we have these multiple and ongoing proceedings, but it's extremely difficult for victims and survivors to both participate in those proceedings. For the Rohingya, for example, they cannot leave the camp. It's extremely difficult. They're not allowed. It's taken almost 1 year. We have witnesses that have travelled previously to hearings to actually get them out of the camp. And then what happens on their return? We know that there's increased security threats and risks to witnesses within the camps. This is a very real threat that we are facing. One of my recommendations is that we need to look at this aspect and see what we can do to address it as a whole international community. We've also got ongoing proceedings from universal and extraterritorial jurisdiction that we've heard in multiple countries. We represent many of those claimants and those victims and witnesses in those ongoing proceedings. In fact, we talk about that they have moved from victim to survivor to advocate. How do you have the courage to come forward and speak about has often been one of the most worst periods of their lives, and then to go forward to file as a claimant in a case, and then often even to travel to proceedings abroad. It's extremely difficult. These are not difficulties that we face, for example, in the UK courts. So we need to look at that, the difficulties of that. And actually, if you speak to many of these in these situations, individuals, they don't even understand what psychological support is. They don't know that in our sense of it. So we also need to address that. And also, finally, I think, what would my recommendations be? Well, firstly, we heard it again, I would reiterate, for the International Criminal Court, they can accept the declaration of the National Unity Government and therefore accept and expand the jurisdiction of the ICC. In the International Court of Justice case, which is ongoing, we should ensure participation of the witnesses as well as in the other proceedings. One comment I would say in the situation of the Germany filing is that we've seen that it's brought together victims, not only Rohingya victims, but also the Kachin, the Shan, and other Burmese victims. So it has been international justice is a unifying moment, for victims and survivors. And I think that's an element that we can focus on and support. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Antonia, for that insight. Our next speaker is Elaine, and I think Elaine's going to tell us something, give us an update on human rights violations in Myanmar. Thank you, Elaine.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And it's a pleasure and honor to be invited to participate on this panel with the other distinguished panelists. In wanting to speak to the topic of this panel, what I'll aim to do is to go into a little bit more detail about the erosion of the rule of law and how basically the military has instrumentalized the legal framework, and then basically its impact in relation to human rights violations. And we see the trends and patterns of the severity and what we're now seeing then possible war crimes and crimes against humanity. So basically, since 1st of February, the military has orchestrated the rule of law crisis in Myanmar. What started out as attempts at legitimizing an unconstitutional coup has swiftly distorted into an imposition of martial rule on an unyielding population. This has been characterized on one hand by manipulation of the legal framework to stifle free expression, to enable arbitrary deprivation of liberty, and to strip away due process and fair trial rights, and on the other by use of security forces to perpetuate a climate of fear and terror. At the get-go, the Commander-in-Chief invoked constitutional provisions to declare a state of emergency based on accusations that the incumbent government acted to take over the sovereignty of the Union by wrongful, forcible means, resulting in disintegration of the Union or disintegration of national solidarity. Yet days later, the President and State Councillor were charged for greeting election campaigners in violation of COVID-19 restrictions and for possession of walkie-talkies, respectively. And within 2 weeks of seizing power, the military effected changes to a whole range of laws, notably the Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code. Basically, these effectively criminalized both perceived intent and actual criticism of the authorities and permitted security forces to conduct warrantless searches, seizures, arrests, surveillance, and interception of communications equipment. With unchecked powers of arrest and detention, security forces began to target and intimidate individuals opposed to military rule. As of this month, in June 2023, more than 23,000 individuals have been detained by the military since the coup. And based on interviews that we conduct with those released from detention, our office has found that there are reasonable grounds to conclude that security forces have been responsible for arbitrary arrest and detention and forced disappearance and ill treatment, often amounting to torture. Such violations are clearly enabled by the military's instrumentalization of the law to provide a veneer of legality for otherwise illegitimate and unlawful actions. This has included subversion of the judicial process through establishment of special courts within prison compounds and introduction of military tribunals in townships under martial law. Again, as of this month, the military has declared martial law in 47 townships across the country. With this imposition of martial law and introduction of military tribunals in these cases, the regional commanders are authorized to try a range of criminal cases summarily and impose the harshest penalties for each crime, including their sentences, with no right of appeal in violation of fair trial standards. So in terms of the violations, what then do we see? Initially, when nationwide peaceful protests began, security forces used less lethal weapons in an unnecessary and disproportionate manner and conducted neighborhood raids. But since then, this has evolved into systematic targeted killings and mass arrests, with torture and ill treatment causing additional deaths in custody. By late 2021, such violence has steadily intensified, especially in the northwestern and southeastern parts of Myanmar, with the military employing its four-cut strategy, including to indiscriminate airstrikes and artillery shelling, mass burnings of villages to displace civilian populations, and through denial of humanitarian access. So if you put the figures, say, of arrests and detentions against one of burnings of properties, for instance, you would see that over now, with the coup in its third year, the number of arrests declining, but yet the shift in tactics, the more brutal and violent tactics of burnings and mass killings, including beheadings of children, for instance, those you would see an upward trend in that. In our upcoming report that will be presented to the Human Rights Council later this month, we show how the military continues to instrumentalize the legal framework and bureaucratic procedures to control and limit life-saving humanitarian assistance. Unilateral amendments to the organization registration law are the centerpiece of an interlocking system linking registration to critical aspects of humanitarian action. In addition to the use of violence by the military, as I mentioned, some pre-existing conflicts between the military and ethnic armed organizations have reignited and violence has spread nationwide. The conflict landscape in Myanmar has changed drastically and continues to change, with violence expanding rapidly. The acts by the military constitute human rights violations across the entire spectrum of civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights. Some of these violations may amount to crimes against humanity, and I will not list them here for now. And some of these acts, when committed in relation to an armed conflict, and there are several of these, as I've mentioned, in the country, may also constitute war crimes. And if I could briefly just then speak about the erosion of rule of law in the economic sphere. So what we've seen since February 2021 suggests a return to economic governance that is characterized by increased non-market interventions and controls and policies that likely induce rent-seeking behavior and corruption. This can be seen as a deliberate means of creating and distributing economic rents among certain groups of businesses, thereby co-opting business elites' loyalty and further entrenching the military's economic and political control. OHCHR has documented this in relation to rare earths mining in Kachin State, involving a military-controlled border guard force, as well as in relation to telecommunications operators with significant links to the military, which greatly increases the military's ability to influence companies to effect restrictions on freedom of expression and to undertake surveillance. I'll leave my remarks here for now and happy to take further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you so much for that update. And our next speaker is Hanh, who's from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, and I think she's going to give us some information about research findings in relation to Myanmar. Thank you, Hanh.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I would like to thank other speakers in this panel today as well for their very insightful speeches on human rights violations, state responsibility, and also business accountability, and some solutions going forward. So my presentation today will only focus on very small topic of human rights, which is labor rights in Myanmar's government sector. It is an important topic because first and foremost, labor rights, including the rights to fair and decent wages, safe and healthy working conditions, is a fundamental human rights. And secondly, it is also at the core of peace, development, and human rights nexus in Myanmar. And lastly, government workers, largely women, have not only been the victims of human rights abuses, but also the agents and drivers of change in Myanmar's path to liberalization and democracy. With that in mind, I will unpack the puzzle around labor rights conditions in Myanmar's apparel sector, especially after the military takeover of power, its unique characteristics, trends, a challenge, and also responses from relevant stakeholders, including fashion brands and retailers to these challenges. So while the government sector has long played a very crucial role in creating work opportunities for the most vulnerable part of the country's labor force, largely women, it has long stood in between the formal and informal economies, and government workers have struggled to earn living wages, formal contracts, freedom of expression and association, as well as to own other fundamental rights they deserve. And in times of crisis, especially from the COVID-19 pandemic to the violent military takeover, workers are increasingly marginalized by their employers and military oppression. At the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we use publicly available media reports to monitor the allegations of human rights abuse in government factories. By March 2023, our Myanmar government worker allegation tracker has documented 212 cases of labor rights abuses perpetrated against at least 100,000 government workers employed at 124 factories, producing for at least 50 global international fashion brands and retailers. Reduced wages and wage theft are the most significant right violation, accounting for more than half of the documented cases. This raised particularly a grave concern amid the rising inflation rate and also the devaluation of the country's currency due to the shortage of foreign exchange. Besides wages, the tracker also documented a wide range of contractual and working condition violations, including inhumane working hours, unfair dismissal workers, denial of leave, unsafe working conditions. Gender-based violence was also widely reported. Nearly a third of the cases that we tracked was related to harassment, intimidation, and abuse. And in addition, we also see that pregnant women have reportedly faced discrimination as they are the most vulnerable to dismissal when the factories have to close down. The tracker, we also recorded a large number of instances that reflect the country's unique social-political challenge with ongoing violence committed by the Tatmadaw, targeting frontline democracy activists, many of whom are government workers. Business-military collusion, for example, accounted for 15% of the cases and was under various forms, such as factory owners threatening to call the military to arrest workers, factory owners locking up workers for several hours to prevent them from joining the protest, or workers being shot and killed while protesting against unpaid wages, among other instances. Given the ongoing and escalating context of human rights and labor rights abuse in Myanmar, there have been heightened calls from civil society actors and also trade union movements for international fashion brands sourcing from Myanmar to take action to ensure that they are not complicit with the regime's oppression. Brands are also required to take in an appropriate level of responsibility for the rights of workers linked to their supply chains. However, the implementation of the required heightened human rights due diligence in the high-risk context of Myanmar has proved challenging. First of all, workers and trade unions were hardly consulted in the due diligence process. Brands have reportedly engaged with Workplace Coordinating Committee, or WCC. This is an institution set by the factory owners to replace legitimate trade unions. And this will seriously affect workers' rights to collective bargaining, because while the representatives of workers are no longer the real representatives, workers lost most of disputes cases that went through the mechanism. And secondly, workers also faced with increasingly restricted remediation. Some brands who are responding to the allegations mentioned that they had case-by-case investigations. However, what we observe is that most of the case investigations yield no good result for worker. Even when workers receive compensation from factory owners, they was uplinked to other agreements, most often to prevent them from filing complaints in the future. International fashion brands and retailers operating in Myanmar also tend to rely heavily on their suppliers to comply with human rights due diligence. And this model of cascading contractual obligations is actually very dangerous, because it's likely to result in suppliers violating the contract instead of companies or brands holding their supply chains accountable for human rights. This is particularly concerning in the context of Myanmar, where labor standards are limited and labor rights are historically not a priority for government suppliers. So further analysis on labor rights allegations and also how brands approach to human rights due diligence and responsible exit in Myanmar will be published in our upcoming briefing in early August. However, initial analysis strongly suggests that workers and rights holders need to be included in any decisions that affect their lives. It means that workers' input should be considered crucial in the dialogues and implementation of investigating complaints, facilitating a remedy, and also decision of exiting Myanmar to minimize negative impacts on workers. And while the business and human rights dynamics in Myanmar is very complex and unique, should companies and investors be able to find solutions to continue or withdraw businesses responsibly in Myanmar, they can set examples of in other high-risk contexts around the world, especially at a time when many countries are now affected by localized or large-scale conflicts. So that's the end of my presentation, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Hanh, and we look forward to, I think you said, seeing more results of your research in August. So thank you so much, all our speakers. That's been absolutely fascinating run through various aspects of the crisis in Myanmar. What we're going to do now is to have a Q&A session with our speakers. Been invited to put questions and answers in the chat or the Q&A function, and we'll look and see what questions we've got there. And we've had some questions already, so I'm going to start with the first question, and the first question is to do with the role of civil society. Protecting rule of law and human rights often comes down to civic power and civil society, and I wondered whether there was a strong civic consciousness and in Myanmar, and how do we support that? How do we mobilize, for example, young people, and what might be some of the key strategies for doing that? And I think I'll come to Antonia first, if you'd like to answer that question or offer some views. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I guess my first question would be one back to you, actually, Stephen. What civil society are we talking? What crimes are we talking about, and which civil society? I think it's really difficult right now for society within Myanmar to that there are very serious security threats to them. And therefore, in order to engage and support them, we actually have to look quite carefully at what they're asking for. And I think that there are ends. We've got colleagues on this line. There's other organizations that are working with them closely and finding out what do they need. And I'll be a bit blunt here, if I may, as well. There's often like, we've got to train them. We've got to, they need this. Actually, I think they know really well what they want. So we can access them. Let's find out what they're asking for. And of course, there's so many different civil society, but I think I would ask us to look at some of the women leaders. They've shown great resilience, and let's see how we can support those women's groups. And many of them are in the bordering regions as well. And I think that's the way to access them in the bordering countries as well, where they've had to leave. And that's absolutely vital that we do. And young people, power of social media is really important, and we should see how we can support that, because that's been their lifeline. And the internet hasn't been so affected as we've seen in many other conflicts, as we saw, for example, in Ethiopia, where the internet was completely stopped. So this is an opener for them.
Thank you very much for that. Elaine, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Thank you, Steve, for the question. I think in Myanmar, there is a strong civic consciousness, especially amongst the young people. When we think back to when the coup started back in February 2021 and the immediate months after that, on the streets and with the hundreds and thousands of people, a lot of them were very young people leading the protest movement, wanting the military basically to get out of power. But the military has clearly dug in its heels, but so have the Myanmar people, and including the young people. We hear stories of, mothers disowning their children, and poets, people who are educated, who during the short democratization period have seen what is possible for them and for the futures, but have had to give that up and headed to the jungles for training, to take up arms against the military. And in many ways, that is what the movement has chosen to do, led by the National Unity Government. From our perspective, from the perspective of the office, it's really important to continue to spotlight attention on Myanmar. I think one of the other panelists spoke about this, given the multiple crises that are happening elsewhere in the world and given the deteriorating situation in Myanmar, it's really important to keep that on the international radar, and to remember that a lot of the young people who are giving up their futures to fight for something that they want and deserve. Thank you.
Thank you. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Han, from your perspective?
Yes, I completely agree with Elaine, actually, because so speaking from my experience at the beginning of the military coup, there was a lot of creative ways of activism. So you see online activists, people, young people take down the street dressing in costume, carrying banners. But I think a few months after the takeover, a few months of protests, people see that activists and leaders are punished like severely, and maybe that was one of the reasons why they are afraid to stand up. And many of the union leaders, for example, talking about the field of labor rights, many of them are in exile. So they are in different countries, continue advocating through different channels. But the people who remain in the countries remain really afraid of, the threats of persecution and punishment by the military regime. So I think creating a safe space for those who are in exile and those who remain in Myanmar is very crucial. And at the same time, as Elaine already mentioned, like not continue spotlighting Myanmar, and not so that the movement doesn't lose the momentum that it created at the beginning of the military coup with protests on the street. We don't want to lose that momentum by continuing that dialogue, the conversations on Myanmar.
Thank you. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to move on to another question and ask Aarif first of all on this one. Aarif, there's limited international pressure on Myanmar. How do you get the international community to use their leverage and ensure that human rights and the rule of law in Myanmar is protected?
Thanks, Steve. So obviously a really difficult question. And,
it is, isn't it?
It goes back to what I guess Antonia said, is that I guess we look at this in terms of a multifaceted issue. There are immediate short-term needs. And I think just touching upon the last question, the immediate short-term needs are obviously massive risks to human rights defenders, humanitarian workers, people who are activists in Myanmar. Of course, for instance, we thought about, could we even have somebody today present? And of course, it would be completely impossible for a human rights defender to even join us on this link because of the serious risks against them. And in the context of that, there are lots of other immediate needs. There are funding required for local civil society organizations so they can do the work to document atrocities and crimes, that they can have basic medical, psychosocial support for survivors and victims. They can have some direct funding to just survive, basically. And obviously, those are things that the international community can do immediately. And of course, they have an ability to do that because rightly, they have done it very quickly in the Ukrainian context, of course. And there's no reason to have at least some sort of coming together of democratic nations, regional organizations, the EU and ASEAN. They can quite quickly, I think, mobilize at least a small amount of funds to start doing some of this direct access work. So that's just a very practical, easy thing, let's say, in theory to do, at least certainly make a commitment to do that. The others, I guess, we're dealing with macro structures, and it's very difficult to set up a new, for instance, tribunal. I know that in the Ukrainian context, but it's something, for instance, that they should immediately start talking about, because we have a mechanism now, the independent impartial mechanism, which is obviously acting as a repository for evidence. But the question is going to be, and this is a question in the context of looking at other crimes like Syria, what's the point of documenting, investigating, and collecting all this evidence if it's not going to go anywhere ultimately? So having in mind realpolitik, it's unlikely the UN Security Council will do anything in the short, medium, or possibly even long term. So real thought needs to be given to a ad hoc mechanism of some sort, either through the UN General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, or from a coalition of the willing, let's say, to look at how we might consider accountability and justice, i.e. prosecuting individuals for these crimes. Because at least the prospect of that will make some of these perpetrators think twice in the very senior positions in the Myanmar military and government. So I guess those are two or three things, and I guess colleagues might have more to add.
Yeah, and well, one of the questions we had the Q&A, which I don't know if anyone wants to else pick up on, is why is the UN failing to provide timely support, and what are the problems that need to be overcome? I don't know, Elaine, if you'd like to offer some thoughts on that.
Well, you've put me in a difficult spot on that one, but
oh, okay, sorry.
No worries. I think that question is a really good one, but there's also, it's worth unpacking. What do we mean by support? So, for instance, the office that I'm with, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, from the human rights perspective, Myanmar is saturated at the Human Rights Council. We have the mandate of the High Commissioner, and then we had Tom earlier, his independent mandate as a special rapporteur. And as multiple panelists have mentioned a few times, the independent, international independent, the mechanism for Myanmar, which acts as a depository for evidence. So at each reporting session at the Human Rights Council, Myanmar objects because there is so much attention that's being paid to it, unlike any other country's situation in the world. On the other side, as Tom and others have highlighted, the humanitarian situation in the country is extremely dire. The humanitarian response plan, and also including for the one for the Rohingya in Bangladesh, is severely underfunded. I can only speculate as to why that is the case. Other crises in the world, the Ukraine war, the needs, therefore, are extremely high. And at the Security Council, there have been sort of ongoing discussions, but we know the politics of the Security Council and how that is being blocked by certain permanent members. So I'd say that there is actually, on the whole, quite a lot of attention on Myanmar, but the observation is accurate that there is only a limit to what can be done. The UN is, after all, an organization of member states and can only go so far as member states are willing for it to go. I'll leave my comments at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to offer, Antonia or Hanh want to offer anything on that? If not, then I can move on to another topic. And I think.
Thanks, Stephen. I do have a couple of comments, if I may, just on the
yes, of course, yes.
This one, if I may, quickly. In relation to the international communities and their response, I think it's I'd like to sort of take a measured approach. If we look at international justice, let's look at the International Court of Justice case that's been mentioned a number of times, Gambia versus Myanmar. Well, we have had a number of member states make their intention to declare their intention to intervene. It's not as many as of the case of Ukraine, but both Netherlands, Canada, Germany, and the UK, including, have voiced their support. And let's not forget that that is also due to advocacy by civil society and others. So what we would want to see in that International Court of Justice case is more states making their intention to intervene. It's really, really important right now, especially as we know that the counter memorial on that case is due on the 24th of August. So it's quite timely. Second, in relation to the International Criminal Court, what we always ask when we are briefing and speaking to member states is, please ask the prosecutor when you next meet him, when arrest warrants will be issued. I say will, not when. When will they be issued, you know? Sorry, when, because not if. So let's keep asking that question. We've seen how quickly they can be issued. I think that support for civil society is absolutely vital, not only grassroots within Myanmar, but civil society organizations. We've heard about the mechanism on Myanmar. They cannot provide evidence for more cases unless a case is initiated. They've been very clear. No case has been initiated by a national prosecuting authority. It's only civil society that are initiating these cases using universal extraterritorial jurisdiction. And I think we could be more strategic coming together and focusing on financial flows. So that support needs to come and strategic in our response. And then, of course, we must urge them not to normalize relationships with Myanmar. We've seen that in the situation of Syria. It's happening before our eyes, and we must make sure that doesn't happen within Myanmar. It can happen. So I think that's another point to press. As Elaine has said on the situation of UN, it's very difficult because they have limited access and they're such a complex and diverse body. Of course, that's a whole other discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hans, is there anything you wanted to add to that? Okay. Well, perhaps I could ask you kick off on another question. Is we've heard about what in international bodies, the UN, etc., what they can do or should be doing. What are the most common approaches by companies, private companies operating in Myanmar in the garment sector and beyond that? What can they do and what should they be doing?
Yeah, so what we have observed since the military takeover is that there's a common acknowledgement between companies who are sourcing their production from Myanmar that is very tricky and it's very difficult to do business responsibly in the country, given the very high level of human rights violations. And actually, in September 2022, so last year, the Ethical Trading Initiative published a report and concluded that the effective due diligence in Myanmar is very difficult, and the conflict context also make due diligence impossible for freedom of association. So with regard to the current approach suggested in this situation, there are two main approaches. The first one is to continue doing business in Myanmar, but with heightened measures of human rights due diligence and also in environmental due diligence. And with the reasons behind the approach is to ensure livelihoods and decent work for people in Myanmar and to reduce poverty. And the second approach is to exit the country responsibly as a way to reject the legitimacy of the military regime. And in the garment supply chain in particular, actually in April this year, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center sent a survey to 47 fashion brands and retailers that we identify that are linked to the allegation tracker to see what are their strategies. And the majority of them said that they are still sourcing, they still continue doing business in Myanmar, but with some isolated, examples of increasing capacity, let's say human resources on the ground, more people checking complaints and facilitate remedy. There's minority also announced that they exited the country or going through the exiting the withdrawing process. And then also a few of the brands also choose the third option, which is downsizing the supply chain to limited number of suppliers in Myanmar so that they can monitor the abuses closer. Some also report that they are on the hold, while waiting for more evidence and more guidance from international organizations to whether it is still ethical to do business in Myanmar. And we acknowledge that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And, the complex issues of human rights and business in Myanmar means that the binary solution doesn't sound like the right approach in the context of Myanmar. However, we should understand that under any circumstances, business as usual is no longer an option in a country like Myanmar. and brands should consult very closely with workers and represent their representatives, which are the trade unions, when making business decisions, whether to stay or whether to leave Myanmar.
Thank you very much. Has anyone else got anything they'd like to say about the role of business in Myanmar at the moment? I think if not, I think we've reached this. We're moving towards the end of the session now, and I think what I'd like to do, rather than asking another question, is just to invite each of the speakers to contribute a last thought, a recommendation that addresses the question of how we can, all as lawyers and human rights defenders, support activists, lawyers, journalists and ordinary citizens in Myanmar, and what we can do to help protect human rights and the rule of law in the state. So with that, and hopefully just giving you a second to gather your thoughts on that, I'll start with Aarif, if that's all right.
Sure, thank you. I think my takeaway is to think about local voices, listen to local voices. They're diverse, thoughtful, and know what's needed. And what we can do is, as an international community, is to help empower and bring them to the table and help fund them, because ultimately it's going to be justice on their terms.
Thank you. And just going round on my screen, Han, I think you're next.
Yes, thank you. One of my takeaway, and I think is one of my observations through this panel, is there's a lot of emphasis on cut off the financial supply for the military regime. In reality, I think it's a dilemma. It's very difficult. For example, in the government sector, according to one of the trade union that we talked to, 70% of the business lands in Myanmar are owned by the military. And, with the many export-oriented industries, including government, they bring the foreign currency to the government, to the country, and that foreign currency is supposedly, be used to buy weapons to bomb civilians. So it's really a dilemma. At the same time, like when all the business withdraw from the countries, which severely affects the lives and livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of workers. So it's really like something we need to take into consideration, given like if we really want to cut all the financial resources, we cannot avoid, make it affect the livelihoods of workers and people on the ground. I guess one of my recommendation, and also echo what Aarif already said, is that we should include the local voices. In this case, in the field of labor rights, it is workers and their representatives, and avoid the alternatives use of, representatives. As I mentioned in my presentation, is a use of WCC, Workplace Coordinating Committee, basically an institution that colluded with employers and the military regime to replace the real voices of workers.
Thank you so much for that. Antonia?
Thank you very much. As this is a UK Bar Human Rights Committee panel, I'm going to focus my comments on that. The UK has been clear in its multiple statements on its commitment to accountability and also the prevention of sexual violence. So I think we need to ask the government more, what are they doing? Aside from the International Court of Justice intervention, what happened following the conference in December? Can we have, we should be speaking more before the Human Rights Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee. There must be a spotlight on Myanmar. How are they supporting grassroots and civil society organizations? How are they meaningfully supporting accountability? And be very clear with them and pinpoint with them and ask them exactly what they're doing. Statements are important, but we need more. We need to put the victims and the survivors at the heart of it. And that's what I urge those on the panel. And so thank you so much, Stephen, for bringing us here today, because these types of discussions are really important.
No, it has been a really good session today. Thank you very much. Final word comes to you, Elaine.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think I'll offer one that's, I think maybe we haven't sort of talked about yet. the National Unity Government, it's made various pledges, commitments, an indication of how it would intend to govern when it comes into power. I think one thing that international civil society outside of Myanmar can do is to play a role in holding them to these promises. For instance, the promise, to the Rohingya that they will repeal all discriminatory laws and policies when they come into power. Those are, concrete things that, if the NUG then upholds, is a demonstrable opposition and a difference to what a different Myanmar could look like, one in which human rights was protected and in which there would be genuine rule of law. Thank you very much for inviting me on this panel.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those thoughts, because they I think they addressed some of the concerns raised in one of the questions in the Q&A we didn't get to. So I think we got a double hit with that last comment. Thank you very much. So on that note, we conclude this virtual panel of the Bar Human Rights Committee Diminishing Democracy session. I hope you all found today's discussion to be engaging and enlightening. Our warmest thanks and appreciation to all our speakers who've taken time out of their schedules to be with us today. And of course, much appreciation to all of you who have joined us today. This session has been recorded and it will be available shortly if you want to pass on the links to people who haven't been able to join us today. We look forward to seeing you all again at our next and final future BHRC event on Bangladesh, end of July. And so please do look out for that. Look out for invitations for that in the Diminishing Democracy panel series. And with that, and exactly on time, I'll say thank you all to you all again, and we'll bring the session to a close. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of the day.
Bye.